So this week we'll be looking at an analogy that likens having to pass a driver's license test to a proposal to having to pass the parenting test in order to have a license to have parents. I believe this analogy fails, and one of the biggest reasons it fails is because you're comparing something that is a privilege with something that is a fundamental right. The Declaration of Independence states that we have three unalienable rights that have been given to us by our Creator. They are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and I believe the right to bear children falls under these categories or these rights. In order to have an analogy that works, you would need to compare something that was a privilege with a privilege, and I believe that having children is a fundamental right and therefore cannot be compared to a privilege. My all things considered argument starts out with Kantianism. I believe they would be against it, and they'd be against it because they'd be taking unalienable rights and allowing the government to be in charge of the process of having children, and I don't think that's something they would endorse. If you would extrapolate this to other unalienable rights, such as who you can marry, what kind of job you can have, or what kind of God you can worship, then I think you can see the problem that Kantians would have with this sort of government policy, or this taking of rights and making them overseen by the government. Also, I believe it violates their second rule, which is treating people with respect. As rational creatures, we should be allowed to make our own decisions, and I think that's a fundamental aspect of our lives. And I believe Kantians would believe that we should be able to make these decisions unless proven that we are not capable, and definitely not taken away before we've messed up or made bad decisions. With utilitarians, I believe that they would focus on three major outcomes. The first outcome would be that only good parents would have kids. We'd have better parenting. Kids would grow up in better homes, and I believe they probably would give this a positive score. The second outcome would be maybe nothing really changes. It's an easy test to pass. Basically, you can still have kids if you want to. If you don't want to have kids, then you're not forced to. But this might kind of be offset a little bit by having government oversight on something that should be a personal decision. So maybe you would give it like an even score, like a 0, or maybe slightly negative. And I think worst case scenario is the government completely controls who can and can't have kids. They abuse this power. They take this chance to control other aspects of our lives that we used to be in charge of. We lose fundamental rights, and I think this is a major negative score, so I believe utilitarians would be against this. Feminist care ethics, at first sight, they might agree with ways to make parents more responsible, and they're probably okay with punishments for unfit parents, but I believe they'd be against taking children from their families, except in the most extreme cases. And I don't believe accidental pregnancy or failing to acquire a license before having kids would apply. I also believe they would be against forced sterilization, forced birth control in most cases, in less extreme cases, and the thought of loved ones not being able to have kids, or never being able to have kids by being forced to have birth control or sterilization. I believe that they would be against that, and they would be for the idea that somebody can change and have a happy life eventually. Virtue ethics, they might be able to stand behind this a little bit. I think they would argue if you followed the virtues that you would be a good parent, and therefore you would have a license, and if you didn't and you gave in to the vices, that you would be a bad parent and therefore you wouldn't have a license, and that would be fine. I think they'd be okay with that. Also, don't think they believe in unalienable rights or fundamental rights, so that allows them to just think about the small picture of personal and not the big picture of how it applies to everyone. Overall, I think there are three groups that would be for it, against it, one that might be for it. And while I would endorse virtue ethics as a personal ethos, I don't think it's a good foundation for government policy. So using all things considered argument, I would be against having a parental license. I believe this follows with my moral intuition. I'm completely against the idea of having, parents pass tests to become parents, having a license. At first glance, I can see the arguments for being they're bad parents and some people don't need to have kids, but definitely against something so personal being regulated by the government and treated as a privilege. I believe it's consistent with my views on the subject. I'm against China's one-child policy, against any sort of mass sterilization or forced sterilization, forced birth control. I also think our foster care system's already a mess, and adding more and more kids to it would be just an awful scenario. Overall, I think it's something that can't be enforced, and I'm against it.